The sun bled across the Montana sky, painting the ash and charcoal of Zara Jenkins's home in shades of blood. She stood there, a ghost on her own land, clutching the only thing she had left of her father, a cold, silver pocket watch. Its ticking was gone, just like him. 1878 was a bad time to be alone, but Zara had nothing, and no one. She took a breath, the air thick with smoke and loss, and squared her shoulders. A single tear escaped, and she wiped it away with a fury that surprised even herself. No one would see her break. Not now, not ever. The barn was the only thing still standing. She marched toward it. Sheriff Miller watched her from his horse, his face a mask of pity she didn't want. "You planning on staying out here all by yourself, Miss Jenkins?" His voice was gravelly, tired. He'd seen this before, too many times. "I'll manage," Zara said, her own voice a stranger to her ears. It was steady, hard. She hid her trembling hands in the folds of her skirt. "My father built this place from the dirt up. I'm not leaving." The sheriff shook his head, the leather of his saddle creaking. "Them Blackwater gang boys. They might come back. It ain't safe." Zara lifted her chin, her blue eyes turning to ice. "Then I'll be ready for them." He sighed, a long, weary sound. "Suit yourself. Don't say I didn't warn you." He tipped his hat and rode off, his silhouette shrinking against the bloody sunrise, leaving her in a silence that was louder than any scream. When he was gone, her mask crumbled. She stumbled into the barn, climbed the ladder to the hayloft, and finally let herself collapse. She didn't cry loud. It was a silent, body-racking grief, curled into a ball in the hay, the silver watch pressed so hard into her palm it would leave a bruise. Her father and her younger brother gone. Murdered for cattle and a few acres of dust. She didn't hear the horse until it was right outside the barn door. Hoofbeats, slow and deliberate. Her grief vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp readiness. In a single motion she was on her feet, face wiped, shotgun in hand. She moved to the edge of the loft, the heavy barrel resting on a beam, aimed directly at the entrance below. The shadow of a man fell across the doorway. "Come out slow," she called, her voice echoing in the rafters, steady as a rock. "Hands where I can see 'em." A deep voice answered, calm and unhurried. "Don't shoot, ma'am. Name's Hayes Montague. I'm looking for work." Zara's finger tightened on the trigger. Work. Here, amidst the ruins. It didn't make sense. "You heard wrong," she called back, her voice sharp. "Mr. Jenkins is dead, and I'm not hiring." There was a pause from the man below. The silence stretched, thick with suspicion. Then he spoke again. "I'm mighty sorry to hear that, ma'am. I met your pa once, in town. He was a good man." The sincerity in his tone was a crack in her armor. It was unexpected. She hesitated, then slowly, keeping the shotgun leveled, she backed down the ladder. He was standing just inside the barn, hat in his hands, bathed in the morning light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of a forest floor after a rain. They were gentle eyes. Too gentle. "You're too late for the funeral," Zara said, her voice flat. "And like I said, I'm not hiring." Hayes Montague nodded, his gaze sweeping over the barn, taking in the damage, the emptiness. He wasn't just looking, he was assessing, calculating. His eyes missed nothing. "This is an awful lot of ranch for one person to manage," he said quietly. "I'll manage just fine," she repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He kept looking, his gaze sharp and experienced. "Raiders took most of your stock," he stated. It wasn't a question. Zara's heart hammered against her ribs. "How did you know about the raiders?" He held up a hand, placating. "Word travels. Heard in town the Blackwater gang hit a ranch out this way." His eyes met hers, and for a second she saw something flicker in their green depths, something that wasn't gentleness. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She wanted to send him away. Every instinct screamed at her to be alone, to trust no one. But as she looked at the burned-out shell of her home, at the endless work ahead, a cold wave of despair washed over her. She couldn't do it. Not alone. 1 week, she heard herself say. You can stay for 1 week. Bunkhouse is out back. It's still standing. Hayes nodded, putting his hat back on. Thank you, ma'am. And stop calling me ma'am, she snapped. My name is Zara. He gave a slow nod. Zara. She turned her back on him and walked away, feeling his eyes on her every step of the way. She didn't know why, but she felt like she hadn't just hired a ranch hand. She had just let the wolf into the henhouse. But in the Montana territory, sometimes the wolf was the only thing that could protect you from the bears. The next morning, Hayes was already working when she came out, sorting through the salvageable wood from the chicken coop. He moved with a quiet efficiency that was unnerving. They worked in silence, the only sounds the scrape of wood and the chirping of birds that didn't know they were singing over a graveyard. Zara was stubborn, determined to prove she needed no one. She reached for a heavy, half-burnt beam, grunting with the effort. It slipped from her grasp, and she cried out as it tumbled toward her foot. In a flash, Hayes was there. He didn't just catch the beam. He moved with a blur of speed, one hand shooting out to stop its descent, his body positioned between her and the danger. It was a move of instinct, of training, not the clumsy reaction of a simple farmhand. I had it, she said, her voice sharp with embarrassment and a new, chilling suspicion. Of course you did, he replied smoothly, his tone even. Just lending a hand. He set the beam down gently, but his eyes lingered on her for a fraction of a second too long. And in that moment she saw it again. The flicker. Something cold and hard like polished steel, hiding behind the gentle green. The days passed in a strange rhythm of hard work and unspoken tension. Hayes was a good worker, skilled and tireless. He fixed things she didn't even know were broken. He anticipated her needs before she spoke them. It should have been a comfort, but it wasn't. It felt like he was studying her, learning the ranch, learning her. One afternoon, as they ate a meager lunch of fish he'd caught in the creek, he asked a question that froze the blood in her veins. Those raiders, he said, his voice casual. They take anything besides the cattle? Zara's hand instinctively went to the pocket watch. Everything of value, she said, her voice tight. She swallowed. They even took my mother's wedding ring, right off my father's body. Hayes's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. But it wasn't sympathy she saw in his eyes. It was something else. A flash of recognition, a hunter's focus. The Blackwater gang, he said, his voice low and hard. They've been causing trouble across 3 territories. It sounded less like gossip from town and more like a line from a wanted poster he'd memorized. Some things a person has to handle themselves, he added, and the edge in his voice was unmistakable. Zara looked at him, truly looked at him, and a terrifying thought took root in her mind. This man wasn't here for work. He was here for the Blackwater gang. And she and her ruined ranch were just a means to an end, maybe even bait. 5 days after he arrived, they were running out of everything. We need to go to town for supplies, Zara said, trying to keep her voice even. I need to talk to the bank, try for a loan. Hayes just nodded. We'll both go. The words were a statement, not an offer. He wasn't going to let her out of his sight. The ride to Twin Pines was tense. Zara was hyper-aware of him beside her, of the way he constantly scanned the horizon, his hand never far from the pistol holstered at his hip. This was not a man looking for a place to stake a claim. This was a man expecting a fight. In town, Whispers followed them like flies. Zara Jenkins, the orphan girl, and the mysterious stranger she'd hired. She ignored them and marched into the bank, leaving Hayes to get the supplies. The banker, Mr. Patterson, was a vulture in a suit. He denied her loan with a smug satisfaction. "Without a man to run the ranch, it's too risky," he said, peering at her over his glasses. "Perhaps you should consider selling. I know several gentlemen who would be interested." The way he said it made her skin crawl. It was a threat disguised as advice. She walked out of the bank, defeated and furious, right into Hayes. He took one look at her face and knew. "No luck," he said. She just shook her head. He gently steered her toward the small cafe at the end of the street. "Let's get something to eat." As they walked, Zara saw them. 3 men lounging in front of the saloon. They were rough, dirty, and they watched her and Hayes with cold, predatory eyes. One of them, a tall man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, looked sickeningly familiar. A jolt went through her. It was him, the man who had shot her father. "Hayes!" she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. He glanced over, and his whole body went still. A subtle shift, like a wolf scenting its prey. "Keep walking," he said, his voice a low growl. "Don't look at them again." Inside the cafe, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her coffee cup. "That was them," she whispered, her heart hammering. "The one with the scar. He was their leader." Hayes' expression was grim. "I know." He didn't seem surprised. It was as if he'd been waiting for this. He hadn't heard about the Blackwater gang in town. He had been tracking them, and they had led him right to her. "We need to tell the sheriff," Zara said, anger starting to burn through her fear. Hayes shook his head slowly. "And say what? That a man looked at us funny? Miller needs more than that. He needs proof." Zara slammed her hand on the table. "So they just get away with it? After what they did?" Hayes leaned forward, his green eyes burning with an intensity that startled her. "No," he said, his voice deadly serious. "They don't." He then outlined a plan so reckless, so dangerous, it took her breath away. They would follow the men out of town, track them back to their camp. "It's too dangerous," Zara argued. "Which is why you'll stay back while I scout," he countered. "No," she said, her own anger surprising her. "These men killed my family. This is my fight. I'm coming with you." He studied her for a long, hard moment, then gave a single sharp nod. "All right, but you do exactly what I say." It was an order, not a request, and Zara, for the first time, understood. Hayes Montague wasn't her foreman. He was her commander, and they were going to war. They left town, riding slow and steady, acting as if they didn't have a care in the world. But Zara could feel the eyes of the 3 men on her back. Just as Hayes predicted, they mounted up and followed. Over the first ridge, Hayes led them off the trail into a thick stand of aspens. "Now we wait," he whispered, dismounting with a fluid grace that was almost silent. Minutes later, the 3 riders passed, heading west into the hills. "Their camp must be that way," Hayes murmured, more to himself than to her. He wasn't a drifter. He was a hunter, and he was closing in on his kill. They followed for hours, a pair of ghosts trailing the gang members. Hayes moved through the wilderness with an expertise that was breathtaking. He read the land like a book, using every dip and ridge for cover. Finally, they crested a hill and looked down into a hidden valley. A camp. At least 10 men, milling around a fire. And there, standing by the fire, giving orders, was the man with the scar. "That's them," Zara whispered, tasting bile in her throat. "He's the one." "We've seen enough," Hayes said, his hand on her arm. "Time to go." But as they turned to creep away, Zara's boot dislodged a loose rock. It clattered down the hillside, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet valley. A man below looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Someone's up there," he yelled. All hell broke loose. "Run!" Hayes yelled, grabbing her hand and pulling her with him. They sprinted for the horses as bullets whizzed past their heads, kicking up dirt and splintering tree bark. They scrambled into their saddles, spurring the horses into a desperate gallop. The gang was right behind them, their shouts and gunfire echoing through the trees. Hayes led them on a frantic, breakneck chase, weaving through the forest, taking paths that weren't paths, pushing their horses to their limits. Just when Zara thought her lungs would burst, the sounds of pursuit began to fade. Hayes finally slowed, pulling his heaving horse to a stop. "I think we lost them," he panted, but his eyes were still scanning the woods, his body coiled and ready. The terror of the chase hit Zara all at once. Her whole body began to tremble uncontrollably. "You're shaking," Hayes said, his voice suddenly gentle. "I'm fine," she lied, but the words came out as a choked sob. He dismounted and came to her side, reaching up to touch her cheek. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Zara." And with those words, the dam broke. She slid from her horse, and he caught her, pulling her into an embrace so tight it felt like he was trying to hold her broken pieces together. She buried her face in his chest and cried. She cried for her father, for her brother, for her lost home, and for the terrifying, violent world she now lived in. He just held her, stroking her hair, murmuring soft words until the storm passed. "You're not alone anymore, Zara," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. He pulled back just enough to look at her, and then he kissed her. It was a desperate, hungry kiss, born of adrenaline and fear and something deeper, something that had been simmering between them since the day he arrived. When they finally broke apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. But before he could say anything, his hand brushed against the pocket of his saddlebag. He froze. A strange look crossed his face, not tenderness, but something like guilt. "Zara," he started, his voice strained. "There's something I need to tell you, something you need to see." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn leather pouch, a pouch closed with a distinctive silver clasp. Zara's blood ran cold. She knew that pouch. It was her father's. It was where he kept the ranch's wages. It had been stolen in the raid. She stared at the pouch in his hand, then up at his face. The gentle drifter was gone. In his place was a man with 1,000 secrets in his eyes. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a new kind of fear. This wasn't the fear of outlaws. This was the fear of betrayal. Hayes didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, his expression a mixture of regret and grim resolve. "It's complicated," he said finally. "No," she said, taking a step back, her hand instinctively going for a gun she wasn't wearing. "It's simple. You have my father's money. You're one of them." His face hardened. "No, I'm not one of them. I'm hunting them." "For what?" "Your share," she shot back, her heart shattering. "For my brother," he growled, the words torn from his throat. He opened the pouch and dumped the contents onto the ground. Gold coins, silver dollars, and a simple gold wedding band. Zara gasped. It was her mother's ring. "My brother was part of their crew," Hayes said, his voice raw with pain. "Not by choice. They forced him in. He wanted out. He tried to do the right thing. He grabbed what he could of your family's things. He was going to bring them back, but they caught him. They killed him and left him for the buzzards. I found him 2 days ago, and I found this." He gestured to the pouch. "This wasn't my brother's share. This was his penance." The world tilted on its axis. Hayes wasn't a thief. He was an avenger. His grief was as real, as raw as her own. They were two sides of the same blood-soaked coin. "We have to go to the sheriff," Zara said, her mind reeling. "Now we have proof." Hayes looked at her, and the cold, hard glint was back in his eyes. "You think the sheriff doesn't know? 3 territories, and the Blackwater gang rides free? Someone's getting paid, someone in a town like Twin Pines." A chilling realization dawned on Zara. Sheriff Miller's empty pity, his half-hearted investigation, his warning that the gang might come back. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. "He's one of them," she breathed. "He's on their payroll." "I'm willing to bet on it," Hayes said grimly. "Which means we're not just running from the gang anymore. We're running from the law." He scooped the money and the ring back into the pouch and handed it to her. "This is yours, but we can't stay here. They'll be hunting us now. Both sides." He was right. They were outlaws now, hunted by the very people who were supposed to protect them. There was only one place to go. One place that was defensible. One place they knew better than anyone. "We're going back to the ranch," Zara said, her voice filled with a new, steely resolve. "If they want a war, we'll give them one, on our own ground." Hayes looked at her, and a slow, grim smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a man who was finally, after a long and lonely hunt, no longer alone. They rode back not as a rancher and a hired hand, but as soldiers. The grief was still there, a cold stone in Zara's chest, but now it was forged into something else. Rage. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The plan was simple and desperate. Fortify the barn, use the land, make them bleed for every inch. When they arrived, the ranch was silent, watching them under the pale moonlight. It no longer felt like a place of loss. It felt like a fortress. They worked through the night, their movements frantic and precise. They boarded up the windows of the barn, leaving small slits to shoot through. They brought the remaining horses inside. Zara, using the knowledge her father had taught her, began setting traps, deadfalls and snares, in the woods surrounding the property. Hayes watched her, his respect for her growing with every clever, deadly device she created. He, in turn, cleaned and loaded every weapon they had: Zara's shotgun, her father's old rifle, and his own pair of matched Colt revolvers. He was an artist with his guns, his hands moving with a practiced, lethal grace. As dawn approached, they stood together in the hayloft, looking out over their makeshift battleground. "They'll come at sunrise," Hayes said. "They'll be angry, and they'll be sloppy." Zara nodded, the shotgun feeling like an extension of her arm. "How many do you think?" "All of them," Hayes said. "The gang, and probably Miller with a posse of his own crooked deputies. They have to silence us." He turned to her, his face serious in the dim light. "Zara, if things go bad—" "They won't," she interrupted, her voice fierce. "We're not going to lose this place. Not again." The first riders appeared with the sun, silhouettes against the fiery orange sky. Just as Hayes predicted, it was Sheriff Miller in the lead, with a dozen men fanning out behind him. They weren't riding like a posse coming to investigate. They were riding like a cavalry charge. "Get ready," Hayes murmured. The first shot came from the barn. Zara fired the shotgun, the blast echoing across the valley. One of the riders screamed and tumbled from his horse. The attack began in earnest. Bullets slammed into the barn walls, splintering the wood. Zara and Hayes returned fire, a steady, disciplined rhythm of shoot, reload, shoot. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they had the advantage of surprise and position. The attackers, expecting an easy fight, were caught off guard. But the sheer number of them was overwhelming. They started advancing on foot, using the trees and the burned-out shell of the house for cover. A bullet ripped through the sleeve of Zara's shirt, grazing her arm. She cried out in pain, but didn't stop reloading. Hayes glanced at her, his face a mask of fury. "Stay down!" he yelled, laying down a hail of covering fire from his revolvers. It was a losing battle. They both knew it. There were too many. Sooner or later, they would be overrun. And then Zara heard a new sound. Hoofbeats, dozens of them, coming not from the front, but from the ridges on either side of the valley. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it was more of the gang come to flank them. But these riders weren't shooting at the barn. They were shooting at Sheriff Miller and his men. A small army of ranchers and townsfolk, armed with hunting rifles and shotguns, came pouring down into the valley. At their head was the blacksmith from Twin Pines and the owner of the general store. The tables had turned. Miller's men, caught in a brutal crossfire, panicked. The organized attack dissolved into chaos. Some tried to flee, only to be cut down. Others threw down their guns and surrendered. Zara and Hayes watched in stunned silence as the battle raged. In the midst of the chaos, Zara saw him, the man with the scar. He wasn't running. He was charging the barn, a crazed look in his eyes. Beside him was Sheriff Miller, his face twisted in a mask of rage and desperation. They were coming to finish it themselves. "It's them!" Zara yelled. Hayes nodded grimly. "This is ours." They scrambled down from the loft just as the barn doors burst open. The scar-faced man lunged at Zara. She brought the butt of her shotgun up, catching him hard under the chin. He staggered back, and she didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger. The blast sent him flying backward, his reign of terror ending in the dirt and hay of her barn. At the same time, Hayes and Sheriff Miller faced off, two lawmen on opposite sides of the law. Their guns barked as one. Miller cried out and clutched his shoulder, his pistol clattering to the floor. Hayes stood over him, his own revolver smoking, a dark stain spreading on his side. He was hit. The fight was over. The valley was silent, except for the groans of the wounded. The townsfolk rounded up the remaining gang members and the crooked deputies. The blacksmith helped Zara tend to Hayes's wound. It was a clean shot, through and through. He would live. As they sat on the barn floor, leaning against a hay bale, Zara looked at the chaos around them. She looked at the faces of her neighbors, the people who had whispered about her, but had come to her aid when it mattered. And she looked at Hayes, the stranger who had lost a brother and found a war. He winced as she tightened the bandage. "Looks like my dream of staking a claim will have to wait," he said, trying to smile. Zara took the leather pouch from her pocket. She took out the money and her mother's wedding ring. She pushed the money back at him. "Use this," she said. "Buy your claim. Build your dream." Hayes shook his head, his hand closing over hers, pressing the money back into her palm. "My dream has changed, Zara," he said, his voice soft. "It's not about a piece of land anymore. It's about the person standing on it." He looked at her, his green eyes clear and full of a future she was only just beginning to imagine. "Let's rebuild this place," he said. "Together." Zara looked down at her mother's ring, then back at the man who had ridden into her life on a tide of violence and grief, and had somehow, impossibly, led her back to hope. She slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. "Together," she agreed. And for the first time in a long time, the sunrise over the Jenkins ranch didn't look like blood. It looked like gold. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption in the Old West, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button for more tales of grit and survival.